our societies, the future of how we work, the future of how we produce, the future of how we learn. And we have panelists Anthony Wong, Anatoly Marushak, who will be the moderator of this session, and Don Passy. And the future of how we learn. And we have panelists Anthony Wong, Anatoly Marushak, who will be the moderator of this session, and Don Passy.
And of course, to our outstanding panelists, Anthony and Don. And of course, I welcome all the participants. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depends on where are you located. Let me start with a brief presentation of IFIP. And as you can see on the first slide, IFIP was established under the auspices of UNESCO in 1960 and currently is incorporated in Austria. IFIP is a non-profit multinational organization in ICT and sciences, recognized by the United Nations organizations and hopefully with UNIDO after our recent application. IFIP links over 6,000 scientists from academia and industry with more than 100 working groups reporting to 13 technical committees, including Technical Committee 12 on Artificial Intelligence and Technical Committee 3 on Education. On the next slide, you can see some of the IFIP member societies covering all 5 continents around the globe. The next, I would like to mention that mission of IFIP is the worldwide professional and socially responsible development and application of information and communication technologies. You can see here participation of IFIP experts in different events, for example, at VISIS in 2024. Recently, IFIP Task Force was established on the topic of sustaining relevant digital inclusive education for young people 5 to 18 years of age. And here you can see the diverse group of the experts who contributed to the final report of the task force. And let me introduce our panelists more precisely. Anthony Wong, who is the president of IFIP, and he's a regular commentator and presenter on topical technology and legal trends. Sorry, can you mute yourself? Thanks. Across the globe, including WISIS, including UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development, on the multi-facet implication of AI. Anthony also hosted a session at the 17th Internet Governance Forum on the ethical practice of AI and upcoming regulatory initiatives. Anthony is also adjunct professor of the School of Information and Communication Technologies. And finally, Anthony Wong is managing director of the AGW Legal Advisory. I also have a privilege to introduce Professor Don Passy, who is the chair of the Technical Committee of IFIP on Education. He is also a professor of technology enhanced learning in the Department of Educational Research at the Lancaster University, United Kingdom. And he is also an honorary professor at Amity University, India. Don recently chaired the IFIP Task Force on sustaining relevant digital inclusive education for young people. And finally, Don honored with the IFIP Outstanding Service and Silver Core Awards. And having said that, I would like to ask the first question of today's discussion to both our distinguished panelists. How do you understand AI governance concept? And I would like to start with you, Anthony. The floor is yours. Anthony, you are mute.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Nida, for inviting us to participate in this panel series this week. So thank you again, and thank you, Anatoly, for the introduction. And a very welcome to Don, my colleague, as well as all the participants for today. So the question is, how do you understand AI governance? So I chair the IFIP Tech Working Group 12 on AI governance, which was established a few years ago. So a few years ago, when I started this topic, I struggled to look at the concept of AI governance as to how would we define this, because there is no global definition or agreed definition about what governance and AI, particularly governance, is. So we should start from first principles. We heard a lot about corporate governance over the many, many years of companies. Then we talked about IT governance because we introduced technology into many businesses, governments, and industry. And now we're talking about specific about data governance. And now today's topic is particularly about a specific technology, AI governance. So AI, as you know, it's a big complex area. It's a multidisciplinary area. It combines technology. It's about law. It's about ethics. It's about policy. It's about how do we ensure that AI technologies are developed and used responsibly. There are various approaches to AI governance. We've seen over the last 6 to 7 years different types of approaches to AI governance. But in short, I just like to give a short definition. It's about the responsible use of AI or artificial intelligence. And it's about establishing working structures, processes, standards, and principle to ensure the safe and ethical development, deployment, and use of AI. And more recently, the topic also includes about data governance, because without data, we don't have AI. We need data, massive amount of data to train and to educate artificial intelligence. So I'd just like to give a very broad key elements of what I believe comprise of AI governance. So if you look at it at the very high level, you look at law, regulatory oversight, particularly in the EU, you're seeing the first example of a worldwide first comprehensive law on AI, which has been passed and which been regularly progressively rolled out through the European Union. But it does have implications across the globe as well, because anything that touch on data from European Union and products which have been sold to the European Union would be caught under that EU artificial intelligence legislation. The current legislation looks at risk from multiple layers. So I'm going to start with the top three. The first, the law is based on risk category, risk approach to regulation. And the first level of risk is the unacceptable risk category, where those products and services relating to unacceptable risks will be prohibited in the European Union. So those include things like social scoring, real-time remote biometric identification, such as facial recognition, and exploitation of vulnerable people. Next on the risk is the high-risk category, which there are a number of systems which are defined in the high-risk category. And today we're talking about education. So education has been rated as a high-risk category under EU legislation. And the third and last category is minimal and low risk, which are not regulated as such under the law, but on the voluntary basis for adoption. The late introduction in the last year was on generative AI, general purpose AI model, So the EU legislation very recently introduced a category to regulate general purpose AI model. So in addition to this unique piece of legislation in the world, we also have many frameworks, ethical frameworks over the many years. Quite recently, in 2021, UNESCO did the first worldwide adoption of the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI, which was adopted by all 193 member states of UNESCO. That recommendation provides the translation of many core values and principles into action, which is on AI governance. So with that adoption of the framework from UNESCO, a number of countries have started to develop their own principles based on the adoption of the UNESCO framework. So I'd just like to talk briefly about one particular country and also on my home country in Australia. So I'll start with Malaysia. Malaysia recently adopted the UNESCO recommendation. It has adopted 7 of the 10 principles in the UNESCO framework, and it was just recently launched in September 2024. That's just September, 2 months ago. The Malaysian government introduced 7 AI principles, and if you read, and I recommend you read this particular national guidelines, because it is one of the mature framework and guidelines that talks about AI governance per se. So there are many provisions. It talks about what AI governance is. It looks at the principles which are similar to what was adopted from the UNESCO framework and also the OECD AI principles framework. So those are highly recommended reading. And also my home country, Australia, I'm based in Sydney. Recently, the Australian government also created and launched the voluntary AI safety standards. And there they have 10 principles, which are roughly very similar to the OECD principles, and it's called Safety AI Principles. In addition to law and principles, we also have standards. So in the last few years, you see a number of significant standards being passed by ISO. I think one of the most recent one in 2023 is the ISO standard 42001, which is the guidelines for governance and management of AI. So for those people who's interested in this AI governance, this is the standard to read. There are many related ISO standards, and they are gradually being rolled out. So just for the sake of time, I'm just going to conclude on that question. If you'd like to read more about regulation in AI, you can read my publication, which is available freely online at the IFIP Digital Library. It's called The Laws and Regulation of AI, and also another publication, Ethics and Regulation of Artificial Intelligence, which has been published by Springer, one of our official publishers for IFIP. So on that note, Anatoly, thank you very much for the question.
Thank you, Anthony, for the comprehensive update. And Dawn, over to you. Do you have any additional suggestion on the question?
Okay, thanks, Anatoly, and thanks to UNIDO for the opportunity to talk today about this important area. And thank you, Anatoly and Anthony, for accompanying me on this journey. So for me, the AI governance concept really depends upon where you sit. Much of my work is concerned with looking at educational systems and how they work when you use digital technologies. So if you're an individual, then I would suggest you'd like to know what AI is possible. What is it possible for me to use what is it that is going to help me as an individual with what I want to do and what I need to do? And is it something that I can use which is both ethical and sensible? But if you're an institution, if you have responsibility for an institution, then I'd suggest that really the AI governance concept is somewhat different, because suddenly you're working with a much larger group of individuals, and those individuals may vary in terms of the ways in which they want to use and can use AI. So whilst an institution might want to know what AI is possible and how it can use AI ethically and sensibly, it's also to do with how it supports its individuals as a whole within that institution. So for me, the concept of AI governance from an educational point of view really depends upon where you sit. Whether you sit as a learner, a teacher, a parent, an educational policy maker, or whether you sit in terms of responsibility for homes, for schools, for educational systems, for government education departments or ministries. And I think that makes a difference, because the concept, the way that individuals will think about this may be very different, which for me is important. And that's probably the angle that I would add at this point, Anatoly.
Thank you, Don. Thank you very much for this additional suggestion. And I have another question to Mr. President. What were the prerequisites for your decision to establish the IFIP Task Force on Sustaining Relevant Digital Inclusive Education for Young People 2 years ago? Please, Anthony. You are mute. You are mute.
Thank you, Anatoly, for the question. I can make a joke and say I was cornered by Don Passy during the meeting. As a result, I had to form the task force. No, it's not true. As you know from the introduction by Anatoly, IFIP was founded under the auspices of UNESCO more than 60 years ago. And UNESCO, one of its charter is about education. And I think that's one of the pillars. And I think that's one of the reasons why UNESCO funded IFIP, or the Federation for Information Processing. So in the last number of years, IFIP has done huge contribution to education. And you can see from the headline, Don Passy is the chair of Technical Committee 3. So the number 3 suggests it's very early in the piece that IFIP founded Technical Committee 3. It's not 13, it's not 14, it's actually number 3. So as you know, education plays a very important role today. A few years ago, when I was president of the Australian Computer Society, I was involved with the digital curriculum for Australia. So that took a few years to formulate. But times and things are not standing still. Digital skills and digital everything, work, life, and play, including on education, is moving at lightning speeds as we speak. So this is a very important task force, and I'm very privileged that Don has taken on the role to chair this very auspicious technical task force. We have leaders involved from Canada, from Sri Lanka, from South Africa, from Nigeria, and from Austria, from Portugal, and from Australia. So the number of leaders involved with Don on this task force has worked hard for the last 2.5 years. So I'd like to congratulate Don for taking this task forward, and look forward to hear more about it at this session today. Over to you, Anatoly.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. And Don, could you please briefly elaborate more on IFIP Task Force final report in line with the emerging AI products? The floor is yours, Don.
Okay, thanks, Anatoly. I think I should say, first of all, that the task force took a very long-term view. of how digital technologies are being used in education. And we felt that that was important. We wanted to try to understand how digital technologies have changed fundamentally over time. Over the past 40 years, they've changed. More digital technologies have emerged and have become integrated into educational processes and practices across the system. So the task force really saw AI and its products as one element of that emerging picture over time. But success for sustaining use has really always come down to implementation through 5 success factors. And that doesn't matter whether it was the internet, whether it was the use of mobile telephones, whether it's AI. We still regard AI as being one of the elements that is involved in that continuous picture of the emergence and use of digital technologies for education. Education has always needed to be concerned about the challenges as well as the opportunities. And that's certainly been common to all of the previous technologies. For example, the introduction of internet offered challenges as well as opportunities. And the same is true of AI. Education needs to be aware with regard to AI of what data is driving it. What are the data that are underlying any AI system? Does it, for example, offer bias? To what extent is it extensive enough to provide a picture that one can rely upon? And then how are those data analyzed by an AI system when a question is asked of them? That's really important from an educational point of view to understand what the outcome is, because then you need to understand how the outcome can address that question. So again, these really are questions that are there throughout the history, but certainly are going to be applied with regard to how AI is going to be seen by educators, by teachers, by policymakers in education. Those 3 fundamental questions, I think, are going to be asked about any AI system or product. What are the data that underlie it? How are those data analyzed? And how does the analysis provide an answer to the question? But also, education needs to be aware of opportunities as well as the challenges. And it's always that balance that education is concerned with, and is going to be concerned with that balance with regard to AI. So there is a future here that children can aspire to. There is an idea that AI is going to be something for tomorrow as well as for today, that it's going to be something which is going to deliver in terms of employment and prospects and new developments. How are children going to be aware of that in order for them to aspire to that sort of future? But how can they also be involved in that? How is their understanding developed of what that means? Can they be supported not just as consumers of AI, but can they be developed in terms of producers of AI as well? Can they be developed in terms of critical thinking about AI, about what it does now, where it might be going in the future? Is it going to be something that can help them? Is it going to be something that can help those who are disadvantaged, those who have particular special needs, those who have particular learning needs with regard to education? And how will teachers be supported with regard to that in the future? It's not going to be something that they're going to be immediately aware of. So how is their understanding of AI and the potential and the challenges of AI going to be supported? And what opportunities are going to be there in the long term? We know from the work that we've done in this task force that it's the long term that's important. It's the thinking about education in the long term which leads to outcomes that are important for learners, for teachers, for educational systems generally. How is AI going to be developed in terms of linking with other forms of digital technologies to enable that long-term thinking, that long-term prospect, those long-term ideas of where it is going? So I think at this stage, what I would say is that from this work in the task force, we've gained an understanding that there are these success factors that are important, and AI is going to be an element with regard to that future. It's going to be an element that can lead to aspiration. It is going to be an element that can lead to supporting the disadvantaged and the underprivileged. It can be an element that's going to support computational thinking and problem solving. It is going to be an element that can lead to teacher development and professional learning. But it needs to be an element that's going to be fed into the long-term strategy and planning of the uses of digital technology in education, for learners, for teachers, for educational systems as a whole. So I think that is where I would position what we've found with regard to the position of AI within digital education as a whole from the task force work that we've done. I can probably offer some further details later, but that I hope would give an outline at this stage.
Yeah, thank you, Don. Thank you very much. And the next question goes to Anthony. Do you expect AI regulations worldwide to be properly enforced in the near future?
Thank you, Anatoly, for the question. So in the near term, I think we have some challenges to face. Not many countries have regulation in AI at the moment. So you can see the first major piece of legislation is from the European Union that I mentioned, the Artificial Intelligence Act. And that will come into force gradually across a number of years on different provisions of the legislation, starting from February next year. And then you see the fragmented approach across the United States. They have different types of regulation between different countries. You have the use of AI for employment in New York State, and you have various pieces of legislation in different states. Then you have some legislation in China. So I think in the near term, Anatoly, not in the long term, we're going to have fragmented approaches, because AI is not just one technology, it's a series of technologies, and it's also rapidly evolving. So how do you regulate something that is constantly moving? So it's going to be difficult. And because AI go across national borders, while our current structures in the world of law is based on national law or regional laws like the European Union, so I can see the fragmented approach will cause challenges and pockets of difficulties across our globe. And also, I think that's where the role of the UN, particularly UNIDO with trade, plays a very, very important role to coordinate and harmonize a lot of this regulation effort and AI coordination in many jurisdictions. So recently, I participated in the UN Future Summit and the Digital Compact. And as you know, there are many provisions in the recent Digital Compact that was passed by the UN General Assembly in New York on data governance and also on AI governance. So you can see the UN starting to play a coordinating role, just like the European Union, in this effort to get more a coordinated approach, knowing that AI is global. It's not stopping at the national borders. So in the global south, countries are not up to speed, obviously, because they do have resource constraints or expertise constraint. So those are things which are going to hamper their ability to do regulation. As I've already mentioned, AI is moving very, very fast. So So it's going to be difficult to regulate something which is moving constantly. Also, we have lobbies from the big technology companies against regulation, and you can see that happening in the EU, in the US, even here in Australia, when the topic of regulation was discussed. So that's why I think the Australian government has decided to do a voluntary principle standards for safety on AI as the first pass in that area. So Anatoly, to answer your question, I think we have a lot of work to do in the near term, but with anything in the long term, knowing about laws, when things get settled, when people are used to the technology, the communities are aware of the risks and the benefits. I think in the long term, regulation's not a problem, but in the short and medium term, I think there'll be lots of challenges for us to look at. So back
Thank
to you.
Thank you, Anthony. Dawn, Anthony mentioned EU AI Act, which includes education and vocational training area in the high-risk AI system list. Could you please elaborate more on IFIP Technical Committee 3 position on this regulation? Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Anatoly. Well, certainly, I can certainly understand why education is being considered in the high-risk AI systems list. Some of my work involves me going into schools and seeing the uses of AI in schools. And I've observed young children in primary schools using AI already in some places, not in all places, but in some places. And it's quite amazing what's happening with regard to the uses of those AI systems. So in one place, I was looking at children who were using an AI product in order to generate an image from a particular text. So they used keywords in order to generate images, which then they would look at in terms of how that fitted with the text that they were reading. And these children came out and saw these images as being excellent. They saw them as something which they recognized linked to that text and something which they regarded as really, really good. But in another classroom, I saw other children who were actually reading a well-known novel by Charles Dickens. And they were being asked to use the AI system to create a new ending for the novel. And what was interesting was the difference that was happening in that classroom. In that classroom, when they got the new ending, they were actually asked to question it. Is this what you think would be the right ending? How could you improve it as children? How could you improve it? Or what would you tell the AI system to do to improve it? Now, for me, there's a difference between those two classrooms. There's a difference because in that second classroom, those children were being asked to think critically about the outcome of the AI system. They weren't being asked to just think about the outcome as something that they would accept. They were asked to think about it in terms of being critical of it. Now, I think that that's really, really important. You know, it's very, very important that we develop critical awareness and critical concern. This is one of the risks, the high risks, that I think could be associated with some AI systems. If we as individuals, if children develop this idea that what comes out of an AI system is something that we wholly accept, rather than questioning it, what does that mean? Does that mean that we're going to lose the questioning ability, that we're just going to accept that AI systems will always produce the better answer than we could produce? What does that mean in the long term for education? I think that is a risk. we have to think about how we develop those concerns and how we create that balance between the idea that AI can produce useful and good things, but at the same time, we should question this because we have the ability to question it, to ask it again, or to see if we can do better. So I think for education, yes, I can see that AI is regarded as high risk because from an educational, a societal, a future perspective, there are risks there. There are high risks, I would say, in terms of where we might be going as a society. And I would like to think that we would retain our critical concern, that we would retain our questioning ability rather than doing something without questioning it. That for me is taking away education. If that's where we are, we don't need education, do we? We just accept what else is going on. For me, education is all to do with questioning. It's all to do with critical concern. And for me, I want to retain that. Yes, I can see the value. I can see the value of what AI can do. But at the same time, I don't want to lose the ability of questioning and critical thinking. And I think that for me is where some of this high risk is there.
Excellent. Thank you, Dawn. Maybe if I may, I would like to ask you another question with this regard. How could AI education influence industrial development worldwide?
Mm-hmm. Well, there, I think I'd go back really to this previous assertion, if you like, that I was making, that I think we need to retain criticality and critical concern and questioning, because for me, that's the future of industrial development too. I think industrial development is also concerned with questioning and moving on from where one is, rather than accepting where one is and not moving on from that position. If we're talking about development, you know that word, whether it's industrial, whether it's educational, whatever it is, we're talking about how we move on, how we think about how we progress, how we make something that goes on further, that does something better, that does something that will support us to a greater extent. So I think that those qualities need to be developed from early ages, and that is also to do with industrial development. If we can gain that critical thinking, that questioning ability, that concern with development, surely that's going to be something that is going to help in terms of long-term industrial development. But with regard to how AI can do that, we can also foster aspiration. We can enable young people to think about the future with regard to AI, where it is going, how they might be involved in this, how they can be interested in this. They might be able to explore ways of thinking about how AI can help them if they have particular learning needs, if they have certain disabilities, if they are underrepresented in certain ways. It can enable understanding, it can enable development, but at the same time, it can enable questioning, it can enable critical thinking, it can support teachers. You know, I know of examples already of where teachers are saying, I've saved a lot of time by using this AI system. And of course, as teachers are critical. They are at that stage of development where they do think critically. And therefore, I think that that's a valid thing for them to be saying, because they are questioning as well as seeing the outcome. And that's where we want to move to. We want to develop in young people their abilities to get to the stage of being the teacher, of being able to use the AI in order to support them, but also to question it. So I think it's important in terms of this long-term strategy and planning. And that, I think, will help industrial development. It will enable these ideas of thinking, of collaboration, of cooperation that are so important in terms of industrial development. And I think that we can do that within educational systems. And I see that happening within educational systems. And I've seen that from the examples that we've looked at in the task force. And we actually now have an in-depth 35-year case study of a particular nation that's developed this approach. And they are already picking up on these exact things with regard to AI in their development, without question.
Yeah. Thank you, Don, for the update. Surely your report on the case study will be published soon. And for the wider community who are interested in this subject matter, they will have free access through IFIP Digital Library. Before wrapping up the session, I would like to address the question from our participants. What are the risks of using AI in managing personal data protection, and how to prevent leakage of personal and sensitive information? This is a question from Alex Goncharova. Thank you for the question. Anthony, wouldn't you mind to answer this question?
Thank you, Anatoly. Very happy to. Alex, thank you for the question. So to summarize, what are the risks of using AI in relation to personal data or privacy? I think there are huge risks at the moment. If you see all the AI frameworks of the last 7 years, data protection, privacy, foreground, center, and mind of every principles that you can imagine. Because a lot of those current AI models are scrapped using publicly available data, which includes a lot of personal information. You can imagine, even in Australia recently, someone tried to sue one of the tech companies because they said they've been defamed with the output from AI to indicate they did something bad when they really didn't, because AI created this profile of them as doing something criminal. So there are huge risks. Not every countries have privacy laws. A lot of global south countries do not have privacy laws. So whether their citizens will be protected, that's another problem that we're facing. Obviously, the European Union have a very stringent 5-star gold standard GDPR, which does protect the people, the citizens and residents based in the European Union, and even if their data has been used outside the European Union, but there's a rare exception. So recently I developed a data governance framework for a state in a country, and I recommended to them that they should not do data sharing without an accompanying privacy law to protect citizens' data. So those go hand in hand, whether it's AI, data governance, using of data. I think privacy is one of the biggest challenges that we see. And so I think in time, I hope that answers your question, Alex.
Okay, and no answer from Alex. So let me wrap up the session with the last question to both panelists. What is the role of both education and regulation in industry development from the IFIP community perspective? I would like to start with you, Anthony, please.
Thank you, Anatoly. I'd like to start with, I was referred to the newspaper yesterday in the Australian Business Review, and the headline says 30% of Australian workforce will be impacted by AI in the next 5 years. So the first question that I had in mind was, how and what is the scope of the impact? Yes, it will be lots of changes. AI has many risks, but it does have many upsides as well. It can be utilized to find the best next cure for certain diseases. We can find huge discovery in nature and many things. So there are many positives. So from the IFIP perspective, how do we balance the need for innovation for the positive use of IFIP with the darker side that we are looking at. So I think it's the balancing act, the innovation. So I think from the perspective of UNIDO, because you do have that industrial focus, how do we balance this huge balancing act with the need for innovation, for progression for humanity, as well as to protect our citizens and all our societal humanity, human rights, privacy, and many, many things. From the industry perspective, we also need to look at the skilled workforce. Currently, we do not have enough skilled people working or understanding the technology, working to develop the technology, or using it or deploying it. So I think education has a huge role to play. And I think Don's task force with the education recommendation, especially critical thinking, is essential for where we're going, because no humans have been where we are going to tomorrow in the future. So these are all new frontier. We have to look at how we're going to do critical thinking to solve the world majors problems, because we've never been there before. There is no history textbook about how to do and to solve those problems, because this is, I believe, the very first time that humanity had confronted AI with its potential as well as its downside. Also, Don's report highlight teachers training, the need for teachers training. Without proper teachers, we are not going to pass on the knowledge about digital skills and digital transformation to the students who are going to be the workforce of the future. So that's the message for UNIDO in industry development. Education is a big and front and center of things we need to look at, because without that, we are not going to progress much. I think we're just going to see a lot of challenges. So I'm going to stop there, Anatoly, knowing that we only have a few minutes left for Don to do his concluding remarks as well.
Thank you, Anthony. Don, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Anatoly. Well, IFIP is an international community. I mean, that's why I'm involved in IFIP, and it has wide contacts and support across the globe. For me, that's been really important over very many years. I've been a member of IFIP for, well, a long time, without question, because I have that contact, those contacts with people across the world who can give me different perspectives. Because I know that within those different localities, those different nations, those different regions, people are tackling things with regard to supporting young people through education and linking that to industry development in different ways. And that's really important. It's important to have that opportunity to be able to share that, so that we may be able to gain from what other people are doing. And it isn't a question of always the answers coming in the same direction all of the time. You know, I've found examples of what is happening within what would be regarded as a developing country in some respects, but with regard to digital education, actually is very advanced. And actually, developed countries can learn from that, because of the ways in which those things are happening. So it isn't just a one-way street, if you like. It's to do with communication. It's to do with sharing. It's to do with understanding. But with regard to AI, which is what we're talking about, I would say, from an educational perspective, we shouldn't regard AI as a separate educational focus. We should think of this within the wider educational remit. How does this fit within the other functionality, within the other skills, within the other competencies that we want to develop with regard to young people for the future, that will lead to industrial interest, interaction, engagement, and development. Because it's not just AI that's going to do that. It's the link between AI and those other skills like communication, like collaboration, like cooperation, etc., that are going to do that. It's to do with the critical thinking. It's to do with computational thinking. It's to do with abilities to be able to use digital technologies as producers as well as being consumers. If we look back at what's happened with regard to the uses of internet and mobile devices, we know that those have linked to so many areas of life, to work, to health, to education, to training. AI is likely to be similar in that respect. It's going to link in the wider context. So what we also need to do is enable that wider breadth of understanding and interest and opportunity, to enable young people to develop their interests in a range of directions rather than a single direction. AI will be involved in all of those, but quite possibly in different ways. How do we support that for young people? How do we build that into educational systems so that all young people can gain an understanding for themselves and for the future and the sorts of interests and directions that they might take, which will help with industrial development? And I think that IFIP, as a community, can help with that through those contacts, through those support, through that sharing that can happen across nations and across regions. So I think it's the width of opportunity, the width of opportunity that education can hold, and the width of opportunity that IFIP can bring, and can work with other agencies, such as UNIDO, such as UNESCO, in those terms, in order to be able to move forward with that sharing on as wide a scale as possible, to enable understanding to be built in where possible, but to enable the future to be seen prospects. That would be that answer at this stage.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Don and Anthony, for your thoughts, for your considerations, and for sharing your opinion today. For all the participants, I also would like to thank you for being with us. I also sent in the chat some link for IFIP Open Access Digital Library. You can read the report which was discussed and presented today, as well as lots of other publications from the IFIP community. You can also find some interesting information on our old website. We are developing a new one, so hopefully in the near future it will be more user-friendly. Thank you very much for being with us, and hopefully see you soon.
Thank you. I would also like to conclude, and thank you, Anatoly, for hosting this session. I would like especially to thank Don and Anthony for participating today, separating time. I really enjoyed this session, and on behalf of UNIDO AM Global, I would like to thank you for separating time to be with us today. I really enjoyed, and I really think that our participants enjoyed this session as well. If you just a note to all participants, if you log in on the platform and go to the session, the discussion is already open. So you can also engage, post some questions, so we can continue to stay engaged on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander, for all your support and for having us today. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Alexander. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.